Preface. The weaknesses of a book are often the counterparts of empty intentions that one did not know how to implement. In this sense, a declaration of intent is evidence of real modesty in relation to the ideal book. It is often said that prefaces should be read only at the end. Conversely, conclusions should be read at the outset. This is true of the present book, the conclusion of which could make reading the rest unnecessary. The subject dealt with here is manifestly in the air. The signs may be noted. 1. Heidegger's more and more pronounced orientation towards a philosophy of ontological difference. 2. The structuralist project, based upon a distribution of differential characters within a space of coexistence. 3. The contemporary novelist's art, which revolves around difference and repetition, not only in its most abstract reflections, but also in its effective techniques. 4. The discovery, in a variety of fields, of a power peculiar to repetition, a power which also inhabits the unconscious, language, and art. All these signs may be attributed to a generalized anti-Hegelianism. Difference and repetition have taken the place of the identical and the negative, of identity and contradiction. For difference implies the negative and allows itself to lead to contradiction only to the extent that its subordination to the identical is maintained. The primacy of identity, however conceived, defines the world of representation. But modern thought is born of the failure of representation, of the loss of identities, and of the discovery of all the forces that act under the representation of the identical. The modern world is one of simulacra. Man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. All identities are only simulated, produced as an optical effect by the more profound game of difference and repetition. We propose to think difference in itself independently of the forms of representation which reduce it to the same, and the relation of different to different independently of those forms which make them pass through the negative. Modern life is such that, confronted with the most mechanical, the most stereotypical repetitions inside and outside ourselves, we endlessly extract from them little differences, variations, and modifications. Conversely, secret, disguised and hidden repetitions, animated by the perpetual displacement of a difference, restore bare, mechanical and stereotypical repetitions within and without us. In simulacra, repetition already plays upon repetitions, and difference already plays upon differences. Repetitions repeat themselves, while the differentiator differentiates itself. The task of life is to make all these repetitions coexist in a space in which difference is distributed. Two lines of research lie at the origin of this book. One concerns the concept of difference without negation, precisely because unless it is subordinated to the identical, difference would not extend or would not have to extend as far as opposition and contradiction. The other concerns the concept of a repetition in which physical, mechanical, or bare repetition of the same, would find their raison d'être in the more profound structures of a hidden repetition in which a differential is disguised and displaced. These two lines of research spontaneously came together because on every occasion these concepts of a pure difference and a complex repetition seem to connect and coalesce. The perpetual divergence and the centering of difference corresponded closely to a displacement and a disguising within repetition. There are certainly many dangers in invoking pure differences which have become independent of the negative and liberated from the identical. The greatest danger is that of lapsing into the representations of a beautiful soul. There are only reconcilable and federative differences far removed from bloody struggles. The beautiful soul says, "We are different, but not opposed." The notion of a problem, which we see linked to that of difference, also seems to nurture the sentiments of the beautiful soul. Only problems and questions matter. Nevertheless, we believe that when these problems attain their proper degree of positivity, and when difference becomes the object of a corresponding affirmation, they release a power of aggression and selection which destroys the beautiful soul by depriving it of its very identity and breaking its good will. The problematic and the differential determine struggles or destructions in relation to which those of the negative are only appearances, and the wishes of the beautiful soul are so many mystifications trapped in appearances. The simulacrum is not just a copy, but that which overturns all copies by also overturning the models. Every thought becomes an aggression. A book of philosophy should be in part a very particular species of detective novel, in part a kind of science fiction. By detective novel, we mean that concepts, with their zones of presence, should intervene to resolve local situations. They themselves change along with the problems. They have spheres of influence where, as we shall see, they operate in relation to dramas and by means of a certain cruelty. They must have a coherence among themselves, but that coherence must not come from themselves. They must receive their coherence from elsewhere. This is the secret of empiricism. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, nor a simple appeal to lived experience. On the contrary, it undertakes the most insane creation of concepts ever seen or heard. Empiricism is a mysticism or a mathematicism of concepts, but precisely one which treats the concepts as object of an encounter, as a here and now, or rather as a erewhon, from which emerge inexhaustibly ever new, differently distributed heres and nows. Only an empiricist could say, concepts are indeed things, but things in their free and wild state, beyond anthropological predicates. I make, remake, and unmake my concepts along a moving horizon, from an always dissented center, from an always displaced periphery, which repeats and differentiates them. The task of modern philosophy is to overcome the alternatives temporal, non-temporal, historical, eternal, and particular, universal. Following Nietzsche, we discover, as more profound than time and eternity, the untimely. Philosophy is neither a philosophy of history nor a philosophy of the eternal, but untimely, always and only untimely. That is to say, acting counter to our time, and thereby acting on our time and, let us hope, for the benefit of a time to come. Following Samuel Butler, we discover Erewhon, signifying at once the originary nowhere and the displaced, disguised, modified, and always recreated here and now. Neither empirical particularities nor abstract universals, a cogito for a dissolved self. We believe in a world in which individuations are impersonal and singularities are pre-individual. The splendor of the pronoun one, whence the science fiction aspect, which necessarily derives from this ere one. What this book should therefore have made apparent is the advent of a coherence which is no more our own, that of mankind, than that of God or the world. In this sense, it should have been an apocalyptic book, the third time in the series of times. Science fiction, in yet another sense, one in which the weaknesses become manifest. How else can one write but of those things which one doesn't know or knows badly? It is precisely there that we imagine having something to say. We write only at the frontiers of our knowledge, at the border which separates our knowledge from our ignorance and transforms the one into the other. Only in this manner are we resolved to write. To satisfy ignorance is to put off writing until tomorrow, or, rather, to make it impossible. Perhaps writing has a relation to science altogether more threatening than that which it is supposed to entertain with death. We are, therefore, well aware, unfortunately, that we have spoken about science in a manner which was not scientific. The time is coming when it will hardly be possible to write a book of philosophy as it has been done for so long. Ah, the old style! The search for new means of philosophical expression was begun by Nietzsche and must be pursued today in relation to the renewal of certain other arts, such as the theatre or the cinema. In this context, we can now raise the question of the utilization of the history of philosophy. It seems to us that the history of philosophy should play a role roughly analogous to that of a collage in painting. The history of philosophy is the reproduction of philosophy itself. In the history of philosophy, a commentary should act as a veritable double and bear the maximal modification appropriate to a double. One imagines a philosophically bearded Hegel, a philosophically clean-shaven Marx, in the same way as a mustached Mona Lisa. It should be possible to recount a real book of past philosophy as if it were an imaginary or feigned book. Borges, we know, excelled in recounting imaginary books. But he goes further when he considers a real book, such as Don Quixote, as though it were an imaginary book, itself reproduced by an imaginary author, Pierre Menard, who, in turn, he considers to be real. In this case, the most exact, the most strict repetition has its correlate the maximum of difference. The text of Cervantes and that of Menard are verbally identical, but the second is almost infinitely richer. Commentaries in the history of philosophy should represent a kind of slow motion, a congelation or immobilization of the text, not only of the text to which they relate, but also of the text in which they are inserted. So much so that they have a double existence in a corresponding ideal. The pure repetition of the former text and the present text in one another. It is in order to approach this double existence that we have sometimes had to integrate historical notes into the present text.